His crime, murder. His name, Michael McDonagh. McDonagh was convicted in 1973 for stabbing his brother Francis to death. Francis died from a wound from a small, thin-bladed knife. That knife was apparently never seen nor found. But we have now uncovered new evidence that the knife was seen on the night of the murder, and more importantly, in the hands of a man who subsequently confessed to 2 people that he had killed Francis. Yet Michael McDonagh and his son Patrick are still serving life sentences for murder. Moss Side, Manchester, where Francis Jamesy McDonagh was murdered, is not the most glamorous of places. But the McDonagh clan have known little of glamour during their hard history. The family have lived in England since the 2 brothers, Michael and Francis, came from Ireland in 1932. The McDonaghs were well known in Moss Side as itinerants or travelling people. And Michael and his son Patrick were known to the police too. They had a history of drinking and fist fights. These are the McDonaghs at the centre of the particular fight that led to the death of Francis. Michael McDonagh was accepted as the head of the family. He married Rose. Their son was called Patrick. They were the 3 McDonaghs accused of murder. Michael's brother was the man who died. He was called Francis, also known as Jamesy. His wife was Maureen. This was the McDonagh clan who became embroiled in the events of February the 28th, 1973. Francis died. Michael and Patrick went to prison, and 2 families were nearly ruined. Rose McDonagh was left behind to cope with several children, who, in the absence of their father, were going wild.
I felt terrible. I had nobody to go to. I had nobody, only myself. My kids was away in care. My son Martin was up in Leicester. I had nobody to come back to, only sitting outside the courts crying. I just really broke my heart.
What's it been like for you with all your children?
Very hard. There's no father to look after them, to control them. They went wild. In fact, I have 2 of them in prison now again. I had a lot of trouble with them. So they're gone wild. They're not the same kids as they used to be. So it's been a very hard time for me.
The dead man's widow, Maureen, has been damaged even more by the cruel events of 1973. She's now having to live in a hostel for homeless women.
Well, it was confusing to me, really, you know. I couldn't get over the shock, you know what I mean? It was all very confusing. I couldn't believe that they'd do it to their own blood, you know.
Did you think they were capable of murder?
No, I don't think they did do it. And to this day, I don't think they did it.
On February the 28th, 1973, Francis and Maureen McDonagh were living here at number 442 Moss Lane East, Manchester. It's a dowdy rooming house, which at the time was providing a meagre home for 8 people and an office for the landlord, Mr. Agby. Michael McDonagh had arrived early in the evening to persuade his brother Francis to come for a drink. Francis had refused. He was still sulking after the events of the previous night. There'd been a fight between Michael and a man called Tommy Mullins, who also lived in the same digs. Francis had supported Mullins against his brother Michael, and this disloyalty had angered Michael. Francis' wife Maureen, who calls him Jamesy, takes up the story.
I don't think it was very friendly, really, with him helping Mullins. I don't think he liked the idea of him helping Mullins.
What was the relationship like between Michael and Francis generally?
Well, he saw them nearly every day, you know. It was quite friendly. They'd help one another out, you know. Quite brotherly.
So, leaving Francis behind in the rooming house, Michael, his wife Rose and their son Patrick walked the few hundred yards down Moss Lane to the local pub, the Whitworth Hotel. As they discussed the row between Michael and Francis, they proceeded to get steadily drunk. They started drinking as the pub opened, and they carried on until they were thrown out. Rose McDonagh describes their evening's entertainment less bluntly.
The pub has just not been long open from we came in, and I wouldn't think to be fair of being closed from our leaving. So we've been in all the time.
For 4 or 5 hours, perhaps?
4 or 5 hours, please.
And how much drinking had gone on in that time?
Yeah, we got a right good drink. We had a good drink. We had a good drink.
In what condition were Michael and Patrick in then when they left?
Well, not really that drunk, you know. Good drink, but wouldn't be called real drunk.
How many pints would they have had, do you suppose?
Oh, I can't remember how many pints they'd have. I'd say they'd have a good few anyway. A few pints.
And what was their mood? What sort of attitude did they have then? When they were going down the road there? What was their...
nice and happy. Nothing. The trees went down.
Whatever their mood, Michael and Rose McDonagh and their son Patrick walked back up this road to see Francis McDonagh in the rooming house. They wanted to sort out their differences. Just a few minutes later, Francis died from a stab wound to the heart, inflicted by a thin-bladed knife. Trying to sort out everybody's movements in those few minutes has proved practically impossible. At the trial, the prosecution told one story, the McDonaghs another. Rose claimed that she and her husband Michael went to the back of the house first. They got into the garden, but the Nigerian landlord, Mr. Agbai, stopped them getting into his house. So they followed their son Patrick around to the front. He found a screwdriver from their van and forced his way in. Rose followed, but Michael, it's claimed, remained outside.
So me and Michael was coming up. So I got in front of Michael, and Michael stood down along there. And Patrick went back again. And I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going back to get something to open the door. So he went back to the van, and he got the screwdriver. On that side, that pane of glass on that side, he broke that, and he opened the door and he went in. So the time I got up, Patrick was on the stairs. And I went in. And Michael was standing here at the steps, but he didn't went to the house at all.
This is the first significant digression from the prosecution case, the claim that Michael never even entered the house. The second, more significant claim is that Michael, Rose and Patrick all say that they saw another tenant of the rooming house, a coloured man, standing in the hallway with a knife.
On that side, the coloured man, he was standing there, and as James was going down, he done that to James, and he knocked him into that room. So we were all pushed out here, and that door was closed. And along there, I seen the Black Mariah come and took Michael for being drunk. They told me and Patrick, go on. If you don't go, he said, we'll lock you up as well. And I said, my husband, he's not that drunk. I said, let him go and I'll take him home. So they didn't. The Black Mariah went that way.
At that stage, the police thought they were just clearing up after a drunken brawl. Once the body was found and the charge became murder, Rose's version of events was disputed. The prosecution were to claim that Michael was in the thick of the fight that evening. They emphasized the events inside the house much more. This house is identical to the one in which the murder took place. The prosecution alleged that Patrick ran up the stairs here, straight into his Uncle Francis and his uncle's wife, Maureen. He stabbed at them both with the screwdriver he was carrying. They went on to say that Michael and Rose then joined in the fight, helping to drag Francis down the stairs. And it was here on the stairs that the fatal wound was said to be delivered, a stab wound which penetrated Francis's heart, causing profuse internal bleeding. The prosecution now hit a snag. With the fatal wound delivered so early in the fight, they had to explain the quite remarkable energy that the dying man then continued to display. The landlord now succeeded in pushing the McDonagh clan out of the front door, with Michael allegedly saying, "Where's my knife?" Francis, aware that he could no longer escape through the front way, decided to rush into this room here. There were two people in this room, Mary Mullen and Jasper Allen, getting ready for bed. They were suddenly confronted by Francis with blood pouring from a head wound. He was shouting, "Don't let them get me." He went to the window, picked up a heavy television set which was standing in his way, and threw it onto the bed. Alan, not unnaturally, began to fight with him, and he called for help to a friend of his next door, Isaac Panton. So the prosecution was saying that in the space of a few seconds after receiving a fatal heart wound, Francis had rushed into a room, picked up a heavy television set, and fought with two men. The prosecution then maintained that Francis went back up the stairs, his only remaining means of exit, and crawled through a toilet window to escape from his attackers. His blood was found on the window ledge of the lavatory. Francis then climbed down the drain pipe onto the thin plastic roof below. He only had a few more seconds to live. He was found dead just a few feet away on the roof of the house next door. And that, in essence, was the prosecution case. The allegations that the McDonaghs had made about the coloured man with the knife were discounted by the police. But the police investigation had a most unpromising start. On the night of the brawl, they had looked for Francis, but they thought he was only wounded, so they gave up their search and didn't find his dead body for nearly 12 hours. The police found Michael McDonagh wandering outside the front door of the house shortly after they arrived, and they charged him not with murder, but with an assault and causing criminal damage. Once the body was found the following morning, though, Michael McDonagh became the prime candidate for a murder charge. Rose McDonagh and Patrick were also charged with murder. At the trial at Manchester Crown Court, the charges against Rose were dropped, but Michael and his son Patrick were sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. The jury accepted the prosecution's version of events. Medical evidence had been brought which suggested that it might just be possible for the dying man to keep going after the stab wound in the heart, that he could possibly have picked up that television in the front room and thrown it on the bed. The legal system was satisfied, but friends and relatives of the McDonaghs in Manchester were not. They were the first voices in a chorus of doubts which the case now attracted. The McDonaghs were refused leave to appeal, and their last chance was a petition to the Home Secretary. Their priest outlines the family's feelings.
Very rarely do they pull a knife. They're fairly good at using the fist if they have to. Maybe the boot sometimes, but not a knife. That is extremely rare. And that night, with his own brother involved, it appeared all the time to be absolutely out of the question that he could have used a knife on the brother, whom we have evidence of his own, his family, and of outsiders, that he was on friendly terms with all the time.
More concrete evidence of the McDonaghs' innocence was sought by civil rights groups and local lawyers. They started from the premise that no murder weapon, no knife, had ever been found on Michael McDonagh. He was picked up by the police beside this bus stop near the rooming house shortly after the murder. If he had a knife, how did he get rid of it? The police, after all, had searched the entire area. Further investigations focused on another major doubt that had briefly surfaced at the trial. Eventually, it was to form the centerpiece of the petition to the Home Secretary. One of the witnesses, Mary Mullen, the girl who'd been in bed in the front room when Francis burst in, had changed her evidence during the preparation of the case. She left Manchester and went to Glasgow, where, quite voluntarily, she told the police that another tenant in the Moss Lane house had actually heard the murderer confess. That murderer was not Michael McDonagh, but in fact a coloured man called Isaac Panton, who owned a thin-bladed knife. The local MP, George Morton, helped to draft the Home Office petition for the McDonaghs' release.
I think in my view, the trial wasn't adequate, that the doubts which were clearly there at the time were not brought out, that a solution was reached rather too easily, that this seemed to be a way of tidying up a case, and the fact that there were loose ends seems rather to have been ignored.
Of course, it was rather difficult to know who was telling the truth and who was lying.
Well, indeed, yes. A certain number of the people involved had good reason not to want the truth to come forward for reasons possibly not connected with the murder. And another group of people were under the influence of drink and probably couldn't really remember what had happened anyway.
What was the response from the Home Office in the long run after you helped to draft the petition?
The letter that I got from Leon Britton as Minister of State at the Home Office in July of '79 said that the Home Secretary would only be justified in reopening the case if new evidence had come forward, putting substantial doubt on the evidence that had come to the trial, and that in his view that had not happened to date, that the information which we'd put forward in the petition was not adding to the information that was available at the time of the trial, though one can say that it wasn't really brought out at the trial.
But serious doubts about the safety of the verdict have remained and have continued to grow over the 9 years that the McDonaghs have spent inside. Today, it's possible not just to tell an entirely different version of events, but to substantiate it with 2 eyewitnesses. One of them told a different story at the trial. The other was not even called. Michael McDonagh still maintains that he never crossed the threshold that night. But whether he did or not, the third version of events, based on entirely new evidence, makes the point irrelevant. It's the second part of the struggle that now seems to be important. The only weapon that's been positively identified so far is the screwdriver which Patrick was waving about up here at the top of the stairs. And the forensic scientists are sure that that was not the murder weapon. Now, as Francis is being pushed or pulled down these stairs, the people in the downstairs rooms naturally want to know what all the noise is about. They were Jasper Allen and Mary Mullen in the front room, and Isaac Panton and Sheila Eccleston in the back room.
There was a bit of a rumpus we could hear from upstairs and that. So, in the end, when the fellow I was living with opened the door and went out to see what was going on, it was a fella come towards us with all blood on his face and that. He was panicking and that, said he wanted to get out the house or something.
In the front room, Mary Mullen and Jasper Allen have also heard the row on the stairs. Now they can hear the McDonaghs creating havoc outside after being forced into the front garden. To add insult to injury, Francis staggers into the front room. In this third version of events, backed up by the new evidence, Francis has not yet been stabbed, so it's easy for him to pick up the television and throw it onto the bed. Alan is now angry and begins to fight with Francis. He sends his girl next door to get Isaac Panton to help. The sight which greets Panton is maybe not unfamiliar. He was a pimp with convictions for living off immoral earnings, and here was a man fighting with his friend Alan. Panton didn't know Francis and probably believed he was a dissatisfied client. He went to separate them. There was a further struggle. After it, everybody left the front room except Francis. Mary Mullen told the police that at that point, Francis was collapsed on the floor, leaning against the bed. And this is where we've uncovered some remarkable new evidence. There was another girl in Panton's room that night. She was a friend of Sheila Eccleston, and she both saw and heard Isaac Panton when he came back into the room.
I saw Isaac come into Sheila's room, and he had blood over his coat and on his hands. I'm not quite sure of his words, but he was telling his lady that he's just killed someone outside. And then he just went to pieces, and so did she, you know, and she's saying, what can we do? What can I do, and what are you going to do, you know? And I sort of, well, just say, well, go and wash your hands and take your bloody coat off, like, and, you know, you can't go on the streets in a coat like that, sort of thing. He looks very frightened. He was shaking. He had blood on his coat and his hands, and just a little on the face, because I remember Sheila wiping that off with a wet something, handkerchief or whatever. I heard him telling Sheila that he just hurt someone, and he started to panic. Sheila started to panic. I was frightened, but I didn't, you know, I just tell him to go and wash his hands, as I said before, and take his coat off because it's got blood on it. And he took his coat off and put something else on, and we went through the kitchen, Sheila kitchen, out of the house round to my place.
What sort of state was Isaac in at that stage?
He was very frightened, panicking, shaking, and didn't know what to do.
Do you remember exactly what he said when he came back in from the hall?
I can't remember his exact words, but it's words to the effect that I've just killed someone, you know.
And what state was Sheila in, the woman he was living with?
She was almost passing out, sort of thing. She was very frightened.
A small but important conspiracy now shrouded these violent events. All the downstairs tenants agreed to say nothing about the presence of Panton in the house that night. Panton told them that he was frightened he would be convicted again for living off immoral earnings. His real reason, though, may have been rather more sinister. Because of the cover-up, the police got very confused. This may begin to explain why they didn't even find the body on the night of the murder, and treated the event as simply a punch-up. As far as the McDonaghs knew, they'd been in a fight, not a murder, and the others in the house were obviously keen it should be treated as simply an assault. It was several days later before the police found out that Panton had been in the house that night, but they never discovered his true role. As she was leaving the house after the stabbing, Sheila Eccleston saw Francis still trying with the last of his strength to escape.
We were going through the kitchenette with like plastic on top of the kitchenette. And as we were walking outside, I could see somebody near them on the roof, the plastic is. So I shouted up to tell him to get off the roof and walked through the back door, locked the back door, and the next morning when I got up and went upstairs into the bathroom, looked out the bathroom window and found the fella dead on next door's roof.
Not long after the murder, Clara Esty moved out of Manchester. Her evidence remains untouched by any of the pressures brought to bear on some of the other witnesses.
I didn't know anyone had got charged for this thing at all. I didn't know anybody investigated it or anything. I didn't know nothing about it until I met you.
The new evidence that Clara Esty has now given us is backed up quite independently by someone else who was in the house that night. This second person, who gave evidence at the Crown Court while still being threatened by Isaac Panton, now confirms that he was there that night, carrying a knife which fits the description of the thin-bladed knife which the police say caused the wound in Francis's heart. According to a retired High Court judge whom we've consulted, it entirely alters the case. Clara Esty's story explains some key pieces of evidence which were confusing at the trial, or indeed only surfaced after the trial. For instance, in their statements to the police, you may remember, Rose, Michael and Patrick McDonagh had all described a coloured man with a knife. They had no opportunity to get together after the fight. Michael, after all, was in police custody, so they couldn't have made the story up. After the police found the body on the roof, no one would confirm the McDonagh's story, because they had agreed to lie for Panton. In the Crown Court, the girl in the front room, Mary Mullen, said that she'd heard from Sheila Eccleston that Isaac Panton had confessed to the murder, but this was discounted during the trial. Now Clara Esty, the new witness, confirms Mary Mullen's statement. Another piece of hearsay evidence now fits into place. A few weeks after the murder, Francis's wife Maureen went into a club in Manchester and saw Isaac Panton with some friends.
Isaac Panton left the coloured stereo and went up to the bar, and he said to the coloured man, "It was me that done her man."
It was me that done her man, referring to you?
Yes, yes. And with that, he turned around and disappeared.
And did you report that?
I reported it, yes, straight away.
What happened?
They never did nothing. Never even looked for him or nothing.
But what of Panton since the night of the murder? He already had convictions for living off immoral earnings. He has added 2 more convictions, both for serious wounding with a knife. Now he's on the run on a further charge of serious assault. The Justice Organisation, part of whose work is to investigate doubtful convictions, has been trying for years to get Michael and Patrick McDonagh released. The new evidence now seems to suggest that if Panton is guilty, then Michael is innocent. And Patrick, despite his part in the early fight with Francis, must be innocent of murder too. Tom Sargent is the Secretary of Justice.
Well, the most important point, to my mind, was that none of the witnesses called at the trial had seen Michael McDonagh with a knife. He was picked up almost immediately, and no knife was found on him, and no knife was found in the house. Now, on the other hand, he told the police that he had seen Panton with a knife. And Rose and Patrick, who were picked up later, were interviewed quite separately, and they also told the police that they had seen Panton with a knife. But all these three were, I don't quite understand why, were disbelieved at the trial.
Of course, the point being that there was no way that Michael could have communicated with Rose and Patrick.
That's right, yes,
to set up the same story.
Absolutely separately, yes. Yes.
Now, there was evidence from the landlord that he thought he had seen Michael with a knife, and indeed he said that at one point Michael was shouting, "Where's my knife?" which was fairly incriminating evidence. What was your feeling about that?
Well, I think there's a very simple explanation for that, which was advanced to the trial, namely that Mr. Agby had misunderstood Michael McDonagh's Irish accent. In fact, quite justifiably, he'd been shouting out, "Where's my wife?" in all the turmoil that had been going on.
We were, of course, listening to having a Nigerian listening to a drunken Irishman,
right,
so
that's
it's
right.
possible that could
Quite
have
possible that there was a misunderstanding there. I would attach no importance to that evidence.
What is your reaction to the evidence, in particular, of Clara Esty that we've managed to find? What do you think, what difference does that make, do you think, to the case?
Well, I think this is quite sensational, because you have a new witness who apparently made off at the time of the trial, or was not questioned, saying quite clearly that Panton had confessed to her that he had stabbed Francis. And this is supported by the statement obtained from Sheila Eccleston, which more or less proves, in my view, the evidence that was given by the McDonaghs at the trial, but was disbelieved, and otherwise the whole thing fits in now.
It also fits in, does it not, with the statement made by Mary Mullen, where she said that she had heard from Sheila Eccleston that Panton had confessed to doing the killing.
Yes, this is just another piece of the jigsaw puzzle that fits together. I think all these points taken together are quite overwhelming. And then you have the fact that the knife described by those who saw Panton with it, according to the police, would have made the kind of wound that Francis received. And no other knife, anything like this, was ever produced at the trial.
What moves do you think should be made now on behalf of Michael McDonagh and his son Patrick?
Well, I think there is abundant new evidence here to justify a petition to the Home Secretary for free pardon for both of them. I've always been worried about the case, but there was nothing to be done about it until this new evidence which you have brought to light.
How convinced are you now about their innocence?
I'm now wholly convinced, without any doubt at all.
A year after we first started our investigation into the conviction for murder of Michael and Patrick McDonagh, they were told that they'd be released on parole this September. They may be grateful for the prospect of release, but they can hardly feel fortunate, having already spent 9 years of their lives in prison for a crime they almost certainly did not commit.